All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome back from break. Our next speaker is Dr. Daryl Callahan, a graduate of KCU. Dr. Callahan has been in practice for more than 30 years. He's a medical director for Anthem Incorporated, a volunteer member of the board of directors for Master Trauma Foundation, and an adjunct professor here at Kansas COM, as well as a 30-year career in the National Guard as a colonel. He is also on the KAOM executive board and here today present the History of Osteopathic Medicine. Welcome, Dr. Callahan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this will be a 21st century look at the history of osteopathic medicine with an emphasis on the origins and the early formative years, especially in Kansas. I have no conflicts of interest to report. I'm a board certified osteopathic physician, family practice by ACOFP, and retired colonel from the National Guard, sometimes a recovering colonel. And so I have a master's in strategic studies from the Army War College, and so I have a special interest in military history as well. These are our learning objectives. They're not necessarily chronological, and so some things we'll do will be kind of chronological, and some will be kind of stacked to make an emphasis on what we're trying to accomplish here in the review. These are some readings that I've used to prepare for this, and makes a nice reference for you if you're interested in reading about Andrew Taylor Still and this period of time in Kansas and Missouri. And some additional references. There'll be a couple other references that might be on a couple slides as well. So this is from 1914, 1915 timeframe. It's a silent film of Dr. Andrew Taylor Still performing manipulation on a patient on his front porch in Kirksville. His house was a gathering place in Kirksville. They often host people there, and he's demonstrating what we believe is probably Still's technique. This has been going around YouTube lately. It's a longer video than what I'll be showing here. If you go out on YouTube, though, it's there and you can see the rest of it. He's pointing out to the students what he's doing. We're not sure who that person is that he's doing this on, but this video has been validated by the Andrew Taylor Still Museum in Kirksville. So that's him on his front porch. He was often seen there, and as you can see, people would gather and talk to him. He was credited with Still's technique by Charlie Hazard, and that's been documented a few times, and especially more lately in the Journal of Osteopathic Medicine in 1996, these techniques that he often would not write down. And he did that on purpose. He didn't believe we should do step-by-step OMT. He thought everybody should have their own treatment plan. But of course, we teach it step-by-step. And here's an example of what we think he was doing there on the porch. This would maybe be the right seventh rib. You'd use your left hand as your monitoring hand, and you would be monitoring the head of the rib where it articulates with the transverse process. And you would bring the right arm up until it engaged under your monitoring hand. And so let's say the somatic dysfunction is under your monitoring hand, and you've engaged it with that first maneuver, number 2, engage the barrier. And then you're going to bring it across the patient's chest to exaggerate. And then you're going to put a force, a vector force, just a few pounds of pressure, back towards your monitoring hand. And that's number 4. And then you're going to draw the arm back through the barrier, and it'll release, sometimes with a pop or a click or just a clunk. And the patient may actually say, well, I felt that. And if that's your barber and you just did it before you got in the chair, he's going to give you a free haircut. He said, we're going to put osteopathy in the dictionary. That was roughly around 1885. It's also documented about 1889. There's a couple of reasons for that. But before he did that, he was an elderly man by the time he did it. He was 63 years old before he started the school. So he's my age. I guess I'm elderly. Before that, he was a pioneer, a soldier, an inventor, a benefactor, a statesman. And so much of that happened in Kansas. Here's a synopsis of his life. This is kind of the chronological thing that you see quite often, but I think it's important to grab a couple of his quotes too. He's well known for his quotes. A student of life must take in each part of the body and study its uses and relations to other parts and systems. So from the beginning, he was about systems of care and treatment plans. And he encouraged his students to have individual treatment plans. But let's talk about his earlier life. Born 1828 in Lee County, Virginia. This is the far west county of Virginia where it comes up against West Virginia. This is Appalachia. This is very poor. His father was a circuit riding minister and physician in the Methodist Church, and his mother was the sturdy frontier woman that raised her children in a devout Christian home. And they taught the children often formally in schoolhouses, but there were times when those weren't available as they moved. And they did a lot of teaching in the home as well. His mother, Martha, is really the staple of his life. He's the third born, so he's closer to his mother. And he had the same mechanical skills that she had. He described her as a natural mechanic. She lived a horrific life. Her father, especially James Moore, his family was wiped out by the Shawnee Indian in Abs Valley, Virginia. And he was one of a few, only two survivors, him and his sister. And he was sold into slavery and worked in slavery in Canada. He bought his way out of slavery and eventually returned back to the United States. So they had told this story many times about this horrific event that happened in Abs Valley, Virginia, when they were slaughtered by the Shawnee Indian. This is his father. He's a very formidable looking man in this sketch. These sketches are from the Wakarusa area when they were at the Wakarusa Mission. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. So these are 1851-54 sketches of his parents. Abraham, you'll also see Abram. They called him Abram. He was really a very devout man, very Christian man, very approachable. He was very well liked. And he was an ardent follower of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. He was an abolitionist. And the medical care of the time was really, there were two prominent teachers of medical care at the time. That was John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church. And he taught salvation, forgiveness, godliness is cleanliness. And you carried the Bible to save the soul, and you carried his primitive physics book with you, and you taught home remedies to patients in their homes. Primitive physics was widely read. It was in multiple editions. He was an abolitionist. There was also Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was, of course, a signer of the Independence Declaration. And he was the prominent medical authority of the day and was for many decades. And he wrote in defense of a concept called depletion. And he was horribly wrong about it. This is about bleeding and bloodletting. But he was very right about many things, including explanatory theories. He's also right about embracing physical and mental hygiene. He prepared Lewis for the Lewis and Clark Trail, and we can follow that trail with the mercury in their feces because he had a commercial product called Thunderclappers that was a cathartic. It has 50% mercury. It made you lose your teeth if you had too much of it. A.T. still lost his teeth, so I suspect that he was a rather constipated child. This is primitive physics that he would have read. The A.T. Still would have read this. This is the 24th edition, 1858. And I chose chapter 26 on cholera. Dr. Durrett kind of turned me on to cholera in Kansas and how important it was in this time period. And so I thought it was pretty interesting. The remedy for cholera was chicken soup. You can see there, boil a chicken, an hour in 2 gallons of water, and drink it until the vomiting ceases. Pioneer life was very difficult. There was often death, and really they had a wonderful education given the conditions of the time. He was a very active child, but he was also a bit eccentric. He was very involved in the home, and very mechanical, but he was very much more interested in the skeleton and was often seen carrying a bone, even as a younger boy. And he could tell the difference between carpal bones and tarsal bones in his pocket. He could put a skeleton together, take it apart blindfolded. So his family thought him a little odd for this, I suppose, even though he was in a medical family and they often learned contemporary things. He was an inventor. He invented a harvesting device that was widely made but did not make him any money because he didn't write it down and didn't get a patent. He learned from that, so he did a better butter churn and improved a from a chimney smoke device. He did get those patented, but did not make much money off of them. He says the first lesson in osteopathy, and all of us that are familiar with osteopathic medicine have seen this photo, but those of you who aren't, this is him. And he says his first lesson in osteopathy was as a 10-year-old boy. He suffered from headaches. He probably had what we consider common migraine because he describes a period of nausea and some visual disturbance. And he's supposed to be plowing the field here. So he's taken the rope and not been working like he's supposed to because he has a headache. And he strings this rope between two trees about 6 or 8 inches off the ground. And he lays over the rope and he puts the rope in his suboccipital region here to do some myofascial release, what we would consider myofascial release today. We do it all the time. It's not very comfortable, so he throws a blanket over the rope and he falls asleep. And when he wakes up, his headache is gone. He did this throughout his life, and he created even a device on his treatment table that had a leather strap and was adjustable, and he called it the angel's perch or the saint's perch. And he used it many, many times for his patients and for himself. We see this today in airports all the time with neck pillows. Indians and slavery. This dominated the home of the Stills. They were abolitionists, as I mentioned, and they end up in Missouri. Martha loves it. They have a home life. They have a home. They have a school. They have a farm. They have a parish. She's very pleased with Macon, Missouri, but Abraham is teaching abolition from the pulpit, and they're not buying it. And the Methodist Church decides this may not be the best parish for you. But we have a place that is, and that's in Kansas. And so they end up moving to Kansas. Abraham goes first ahead of the family, and he builds a cabin. And you can see this is a very trying time in Kansas and Nebraska because Missouri has been what's known as the compromise state. And so there's been both slavery and abolition. And Kansas is being talked about as being a free state. And so as Frederick Douglass said, the Kansas-Nebraska bill is an open invitation to a fierce and bitter strife. And indeed it was. We had this contrast of war and peace in Kansas that happened. You have the peaceful Still cabin, contrast against John Brown holding a Bible and a rifle, and a mural that is famous to Kansas, the Tragic Prelude, versus the Still cabin there on the Wakarusa Mission. This is the cabin that Abraham built. And good thing about becoming a Kansas territory is that you get a survey. And this is a survey from 1857, and that's Douglas County. And at the top of Douglas County, of course, is the Kaw River, or what we today would call the Kansas River. And if you look closely at this, you will see, when I turn on my pointer here, that this is Lecompton. This would be Lawrence. This is the Wakarusa territory right in here. And this is Sebastian. So we're going to blow that up a little bit. This is the Wakarusa territory that I was talking about. And you see there's two rectangles here. This larger rectangle is blown up over here. And you see that log house. That's the Still house. It's in the 8th section. This is the Fish Hotel that I've circled here. And you can see this is the road to Westport. That's going to become very important later in the talk. And you see I've blown it up even further here. And that's the Fish Hotel and the log house. They were close neighbors. Pascal Fish lived there. He claimed that property. His father claimed that property. Pascal Fish Jr. is who they would have known. They recruited the Stills to that area because they were abolitionists as well. There was another well-known man, Tom Johnson, whom Johnson County is named for, that had the other mission, Shawnee Mission, that we commonly know in Kansas City. Tom Johnson owned slaves and had a slave camp. Pascal Fish did not want his Indians to be involved in that, so he wanted abolitionists to run the school there. Federal government had come in, they'd made treaties, they were going to pay for this school. So the Stills were running a school for the Fishes, and Fish was the chief of the Shawnee tribe. He had adopted a son, a German son, that became Pascal Jr. Pascal Jr. was not an Indian, but he became the leader of the tribe. And so he was working, the Stills were working for Pascal Fish Jr. They would see him almost every day. He had up to 40 children that were doing school in that log cabin. And he had a ferry that ferried people across the river that he inherited from his father. And so the people that would get ferried across the river would stay at the Fish Hotel. Fish Hotel was a barn with hay. And you would overnight there and get your livestock ready for the trip on either the Santa Fe, the Oregon, or the California Trail. I also have pointed out here Blanton's Bridge. This is south of Lawrence, basically, this other rectangle. Blanton's Bridge becomes very important in 1855. There's a man known as Abbott, J.B. Abbott or James Abbott, also Major Abbott when Wakarusa War kicks off. He is well known because he fired the first shots of the Wakarusa War accidentally. He would form up posses or groups of men that would help enforce abolition. So they would free slaves in Kansas, and the pro-slavery group would then go arrest the guy that freed the slave, and they would hold him and try to move him back to Missouri to be tried. And a man named Abbott would then form a rescue party and try to rescue him. And this is a picture of a rescue party from 1859, an actual picture of Abbott there blown up. This man that's seated in that rescue party is the man they rescued before he would go to jail for freeing slaves. So this was a very volatile time, as you can imagine. Same thing happened in 1855 at Blanton's Bridge. They were blocking the bridge and keeping them from taking a man that had freed a slave. And those became the first shots of the Wakarusa War, and maybe the first shots of the Civil War, really. Andrew Taylor Still and Abbott were in hiding along the Kaw River, and they were talking. They hid out for a couple of months, and they talked quite a bit, and they talked about the system of medical care at that time, and it's in the autobiography. A.T. talks about James Abbott and how Abbott talked about overturning the system of medical care, that it was inadequate. Also in the autobiography is A.T. on his mule here. He would have to unsling his rifle and carry 2 pistols to remain safe on the trails, and he would be going to see patients. And he was well known to have treated people from both sides of the conflict. And at this point, he was stopped by pro-slavery men, a man named as Captain Owens, and he was recognized. Oh, that's Dr. Still. This is Dr. Still, the damnedest abolitionist out of hell, who's not afraid of hell or high water. In politics, he's our enemy. Sickness, he has proven to be our friend. And Captain Owens gave him free passage and also escorted him to his patient and described how Still had saved his wife's wife from cholera. You can find evidence of the Still family in this area. It's commonly known as Eudora, Kansas today. Pascal Fish had a daughter. Her name was Eudora. When he sold his claims, after he was able to verify his claims and Kansas was becoming a state, he sold his claims. He sold them to German immigrants, and in honor of his daughter, they named the town Eudora. The Still family then had to leave because they had sold the claims. So they went south to Palmyra, which is just south of there, and that became common-day Baldwin. They helped found the town of Baldwin and Baker University. The Still family gave 480 acres to that project. And Abram Still built the sawmill that was used to build a lot of the buildings. But in Eudora today, we can see multiple evidence of the Still family, including the graves of Abraham and Martha Still. And there's a really nice medallion on Abraham's grave there of a circuit riding minister. One of the brothers, James, which we're going to talk about a little bit, also the same name as Martha's father, he practiced in Eudora for a couple of decades, and so did his son Summerfield. There's Abraham Still Park there on 14th Street, and on Elm Street is the site where the log cabin used to be. So it's time to test our knowledge, and I think I've probably given this away. We know it probably to be that A.T. Still's mother family was massacred by the Shawnee. So A.T. Still decides to run for office, and you can see here there's more evidence of the involvement of J.B. Abbott. As you can see, he's the secretary of this mass convention that's going to happen. There had been an election. It was declared to be invalid because so many people came over from Missouri and voted illegally. Imagine that. And so they decided to hold another election. They declared that election was invalid, and if you didn't live in Kansas for at least 6 months, you couldn't vote. And so they held another election, and that became the free election. A.T. ran in that election and was elected to the first free legislature. This was a legislature that was seated by force. And you can go to Lecompton today, territorial capital, and you can see this photo, and I've circled AT down here in this corner, and that's a picture of him at about 29 years old. And you can see one of the polling places for this mass convention is the Fish Hotel. So this was a well-known site. They were seated, this free legislature was seated by force. AT was one of the first ones there, as he says in his autobiography. He arrived early, and there were bushwhackers there from Missouri, and they were going to disrupt this process. And he was confronted by these men. They said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm here to help seat the legislature. General Lane has sent me." And he opens up his coat, and he has his 2 pistols on his belt. And about that time, thank God, General Lane comes over the hill with a 700-man army and a band, and he seats the legislature by force with this entourage. This entourage can be seen in this mural at the Watkins Museum in Lawrence, Kansas. If you haven't been to the Watkins Museum on Mass Street, it is really a marvelous place. Still has personal tragedies. He serves in the legislature from 1857 to 59. He probably would have signed the Constitution of Kansas had his wife not died. His wife dies in 1859, leaves him with 3 children. He says that she died of the first thing that came along. Her death was unrecorded as to the cause, but she was 2 months postpartum, and she was in postpartum depression. And he from that point on, he knew that when people get depressed, they're more likely to do things and get ill. And he said she just caught the first disease that came along. She was so depressed, he couldn't get her out of it. They had lost a child at 6 days of age. He ends up marrying Mary Elvira Turner. She said she'd never marry a doctor because her dad was a doctor, but she did anyway, of course. She was a career woman. She had a pharmacy. She was known as a druggist, and she was a career woman. It's kind of nice that your second wife has the same first name as your first wife. You don't get them confused that way. He does not return to political life due to this hardship. But he does join the Civil War. In 1861, the Civil War kicks off. This is Andrew Taylor still in his Civil War uniform, taken at Fort Leavenworth. And he enlists. He's a private in this photograph. He is rapidly promoted to hospital steward. So he went from like E1 to E4 or E5. They recognized he had these medical skills. And the Surgeon General of the Army had written in his reports that they were going to do this hospital steward program because they needed to clear the battlefield of the wounded, and that they needed these sturdy frontier men because he knew he didn't have that kind of force, and he wanted that kind of force. And these men knew how to survive on the frontier, and AT was one of these men. They rapidly promoted him. He did not go to Fort Leavenworth and take a hospital steward course. They have no record of him there taking a course. It was done by apprentice, and they decided he had the skills, and he demonstrated he had the skills, and indeed he did. He saved a couple of men's legs in Missouri right after the Battle of Lexington. There were multiple skirmishes in a place known as Cass County, Missouri, right across from Johnson County, where the border war was very active. And he could find the femoral artery, and he helped save a couple of men's legs that would otherwise have been amputated. And he recognized that the field sanitation issues were horrific. And he writes about this. The other photo is from his autobiography, and this is in 1864. He's a major in this photo, and he's leading men into battle on his mule, and that's the Battle of the Big Blue. And that also is in Missouri. So he serves from 1861 to 62. He musters out in 1862 in Harrisonville, Missouri, and he goes back to work for a while, and then he comes back into the military, and they're called urgently to this proclamation that's made by the governor of Kansas. This is Governor Carney's proclamation that Kansas is going to be under attack very soon by the Confederate Army. And they have made another sweep through Missouri at this time. The Confederacy is in desperate straits, and they're looting as they go, and he has 100 wagons full of loot, and he's trying to get it back to Arkansas and Texas. And he has a rather formidable force, but they're not winning very many battles. And they are trying to attack our armories, and they're trying to gather everything they can for this war. So he starts heading towards Kansas City. So they know he's coming. And the Union Army doesn't have enough men at Fort Leavenworth. They only had about 5,000 men anyway. Most of them were out in the West in the Indian territories. And so they put the call out quickly, and they get 15,000 men to come into these regiments rather quickly and put them on the border. And they put them in Shawneetown. And this is a letter that was written from that encampment to the Lawrence Tribune on 20th of October, 1864. And you can see here it says, a few words from the 21st Regiment KSM, Kansas State Militia. These men are under the governor's control. He would not release them to the Union Army. They were under the governor's control. They went to the border. They were not to go into Missouri just yet. Only if needed. They were a reserve force. They were going to protect the border. So we are enjoying a very pleasant situation in a beautiful field, joining the old Johnson mission. The old Johnson mission. Tom Johnson has been murdered. He famously switched sides from the Confederacy to the Union for economic reasons, because the Confederacy was going under economically, and he was murdered for it. So it's the old Johnson mission at this point. We are enjoying camp life with a zest equal to a young Quaker kissing his life. There was also a Quaker mission nearby, so that's the little joke about the Quakers. We think ourselves just as good soldiers as we ever marshaled on the plains of Kansas. The boys are all anxious to have a conflict with old Price. That's the Confederate General Price who's making his sweep. He's the one that did the Battle of Lexington in 1861. He's trying to make that same sweep again. It's not going as well. And they're under the command, they say, of Colonel Sandy Lowe, or Colonel S. Lowe, the gallant 21st. And they make a mention of Major A. Still can be seen gallantly taking his position with all his eccentricities, fearless of danger. The major's presence inspires the men with life and jollity, which makes camp life comparatively pleasant and easy. Sounds wonderful, doesn't he? So this is where they're headed. They're at the border and they're called into service. General Curtis needs them, and he needs them down around Hickman Mills. And he calls them into service because the 2nd Regiment is there ahead of them, also a Kansas State Militia Regiment, an infantry regiment. And we have a really great record of this, what happens here at the Big Blue, because of this man, Samuel Reeder. Private Reeder is a wonderful artist, and he keeps these beautiful journals of Kansas, and they can be found at the Kansas State Historical Society. And this is an actual journal that you can find there. And this is journal number 11. You can see they go all the way back to 1854. So this young man has kept these beautiful records, but he's in the 2nd Regiment, and he is at this lane that they're supposed to block. They're doing blocking procedures, blocking maneuvers. There are places where they know people ford the river. There are roads they know they could block. And General Curtis is trying to shape the battlefield. And he's trying to force the Confederate Army towards Westport, where there will be a big battle, and they will be defeated. And it'll be almost as big and as important as Gettysburg. It's known as the Gettysburg of the West, this battle. This is 2 days before that at the Big Blue. And they're trying to ford the river there. And they're trying to block this road and shape the battlefield. The 2nd Regiment is in a flanking, they're in a flank. They're on the flank. They're trying to protect the flank. That's a bad place to be. But this is another piece of art that Reeder did. And this is the official piece of art about the Battle of the Big Blue. And that's what happens in the Army. They like history and they have Army heritage things, and they often sanction a piece of art. This is that piece of art for the Battle of the Big Blue. That's the 2nd Regiment. You can see they're skirmishing in a line. They call that a skirmish line. And you see up on the horizon, that's the Confederate Army coming over the hill there. That is a division of cavalry. That's 5,000 men. A regiment is about 500 men. They're going to get killed and creamed. And this is what it looks like when a Confederate division goes through a regiment of infantry. It was very bad. They lost 100 men. They had 50 wounded, and they had 50 captured POW, including Reeder. And so we have an account of what it was like to be a POW from Reeder as well. These are the men that the 21st Regiment are coming to assist. And indeed, they do a good job, and they are firing into the Confederacy, and they steer them towards Westport. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. The commander of the 2nd Regiment doesn't think so. Colonel Veal writes a terrible after-action report. They didn't get there soon enough. My men got killed, you know. But General Curtis, the overall general of the Union Army, says, no, they did exactly what we wanted them to do. They steered them right where we wanted them to go, and he gave them accolades. So the 21st did well in the Union general's eyes, but not so well according to Colonel Veal, because his men were really taken back by this battle. So this is all lost to history. AT still gives us all this, but we can't find any record of it. We can't find a record of the 21st Regiment until June, when we found this. And this is the payroll of the 21st Regiment. I realize it's a little hard to read the way it's projected. I'm going to blow it up a little bit more, but I wanted to give you an idea how large this is. It's a ledger, and ledgers back then were about 3 feet, 4 feet long. So when you opened them up, they were like 6 or 8 feet long. And the entire military record of one soldier would be on one line all the way across. And it'd have his name, his rank, his date of birth, where he's from, what his military occupation was, when he mustered in or out, was he wounded, etc. There were thousands of these books. There were 15,000 men. They couldn't find the book for the 21st Regiment, so they didn't think it existed. So when they went to apply for their pensions, they couldn't get them. But it does exist, and it's in typeset. It's not in handwriting like you would see all the other books. And we're going to blow this up, and indeed this is the payroll. And there's Andrew Taylor Still. You can see Sandy Lowe. Colonel Lowe is the commander of the unit. So this is the field and staff this is the headquarters company for the regiment. And Sandy Lowe is the commander. Andrew Taylor Still is the major. He is the field officer. Indeed, he would be the one leading men into battle, third in command. And a little further down, you see James M. Still. That's his older brother, the surgeon. James Still has recently graduated from Rush Medical College in Chicago, about 6 months before this. He's also a theologian. He has a degree and credentials as a minister, just like his father. You can see another very important part about this is that the men are not paid until 1870. The battle was in 1864. They weren't paid for 6 years. So we've taken this information, this is the same data, and put it on an Excel spreadsheet, and the young man that's been doing our IT today is accredited for this spreadsheet here at the bottom, Adam Bontrager. There's a lot of data on that sheet. You can see a lot of information at the top about the headquarters company and the dates. You can see the men's names, the dates they served, and how they were paid. But the really important part is down here at the bottom. This payroll isn't closed until 1907. So if you're looking for the payroll of the 21st Regiment in 1864, you got to look in 1907. Nobody's doing that. And I tried to look for it back in 2007, 2009, when I was in Army War College, because I wanted to write about A.T. Still, because you have to write term papers, right? And I couldn't find much on him. Nobody can. He says, I'm in F Company of the Kansas Volunteers, 9th Kansas Volunteers. He says that in his autobiography. He says it when he applies for his pension. There's no F Company of the 9th Kansas Volunteers until after the Civil War, during the Indian Wars. So nobody can find this stuff. So he can't get a Civil War pension. Indeed, he went to Fort Leavenworth and he enlisted, and indeed he was in the 21st. When he went to Fort Leavenworth and enlisted, they put them in the Cass County Home Guard, a Missouri unit. And eventually they found him there, and he did finally get a Civil War pension for that enlisted service, but he never could get the Civil War pension for the 21st. It became kind of the lost unit. And if you went to the Kansas National Guard Museum and you asked General Gerhardt, where's the 21st? He'd say, Doc, we don't have a 21st. Because I went and did that this summer, and I said, sir, I think we do. And I started to show him these things, and indeed, these things are there now because they've been digitized, and they're on Kansas Memories at the Kansas State Historical Society. So I've shown this publicly once before, so this would be the second time that we've seen it, 1907. Adjutant General Hughes signs this, and he puts it in the biennial report to the governor. And he says it's the darkest day in Kansas history that we've taken this long to close these claims. There were thousands of these claims. Kansas put in thousands of claims to the federal government. Federal government would have to pass legislation, and they would try to pay these claims. And that's why it took so long for these men to get paid and for these claims to get settled. There were claims for property and all kinds of things. So it took a long time until 1907 to finally settle all the Civil War claims that Kansas had. So you can imagine he's disillusioned. He's lost his family to epidemics. They've lost all these Shawnee Indians to epidemics. He's had these battles. He's been in the Civil War. He didn't get paid. He had many, many things to be disillusioned about. He was very disillusioned about the medical care of the day, especially. And he talks about in his autobiography how he had lengthy talks with James, his brother, the theologian and the learned one from Rush University, about all of these things. And he was saying the medical care that we're delivering isn't working. And his brother says, you know, you can't do what you're going to do though. And he wants to use these musculoskeletal techniques that he's been using anyway. And people are coming out of these sessions with his treatments, and they're saying, you know, it's a miracle. I can walk again, or my pain's better. And so he gets a lot of criticism for this. And they say it's laying on of hands, and only Christ can do that. And he is labeled a apostate by the Methodist Church from the pulpit in the church that his dad built. That's disillusioned. So this is a decade of struggle for A.T. Still. I've laid it out in a timeline here. So during this period of time, he's back and forth between Kansas and Missouri, still claiming Baldwin in his home, and I'll show you a little bit about that. But he goes, you know, there's commerce between these two missions. There's the family has a homestead in Macon, Missouri. His brother Edward, the oldest, is still there. He's a practicing physician himself. But when he goes back to visit his brother Edward, he finds out that his brother Edward is addicted to morphine and alcohol for his pain from the Civil War. He was also in the Civil War as a surgeon. And so he uses his musculoskeletal techniques on his own brother, and his brother says, I think you're onto something, but I got to tell you, the family thinks you're crazy. And indeed, he shows him a letter that James had written and said, you know, I think I worry about my brother's sanity. I'm not sure he's doing the right thing. So he was really in an uphill battle. And he says, legions of men and women were staggering to and fro all over the land, crying for freedom from habits of drug and drink. You can see that still today. He says, my science or discovery was born in Kansas under many trying circumstances. And he quotes Henry Ward Beecher and says the frontier was a good place to get the truth. He was not the only one saying these things. Some very famous people were saying the same thing, including Oliver Wendell Holmes to the Massachusetts Medical Society in 1860. And he basically said, if we took all of medicine today and threw it at the bottom of the sea, mankind would be better, but the fishes would be worse. So he said there had to be a better way. And we often see him and many photographs of him holding a bone. And he did this as a child even. They said he was so always enamored with the skeletal system. And he said, I began to see during the Civil War in the parts of the states of Missouri and Kansas where the doctors were shut out, children didn't die. So, and that's pretty much a reference to his family, because his own father and his brother James were attending to the deaths of his children. And they didn't have a very good effect on them either. So he knew there had to be a better way, and he decided it was this musculoskeletal approach. He observed successes, and he develops these treatment plans. He dabbles in some other things. There was magnetic healing at the time. There was bone setting. There were several different things that he did. There were some homeopathic things going on, but he settled in on this musculoskeletal approach, and he largely used that on multiple cases with success. And I can go into some of those a little bit more, but he recognized the importance, the main thing, he recognized the importance of the vascular system, lymphatic system, where it traversed the body in special places and how to manipulate those areas to get the effect that you were wanting. And he thought the body had the ability to heal itself, and that there was this structure and function reciprocal relationship. But he says the cradle of osteopathy was in Baldwin, Kansas. And this is the home that the Stills had. And we know he claimed this as his home up to 1875, because on his claim, and you can see there, the claim that's in front of us is from his Civil War claim for his pension. And on number 10, it says, where have you lived since discharge from the military? And he says, Baldwin, Kansas to 1875, then Kirksville, Adair County, Missouri to this date. So he claimed Kansas as home well after the Civil War. And he said, I could walk down the streets of Baldwin and be by myself because everyone else went the other way because he was an apostate and shunned. So he wasn't able to make much of a living there in Baldwin, and he was going back and forth to the Macon, Missouri area. His wife was still there. She was a druggist. So she had a career. So she was still working there. And his children were there. So it's time to test our knowledge. What happened on June 22nd, 1874? Which of the following things happened? C, flung the banner of osteopathy. Why does he say he flung the banner of osteopathy on June 22nd, 1874? He's contemplating, what kind of physician am I going to be? And for the first time, they start registering physicians in 1874. And Missouri is one of those places where they're registering physicians. So he has to go down to the county courthouse and he has to register as a physician. And so this is a copy of that registration. So he has to think to, he's thinking to himself, and he thinks about it for a couple of months. He's like, what kind of physician am I going to be? What am I going to say I am when I register as a physician? And he says, I'm going to practice osteopathy. And so that's when he really made a conscious decision. That's why he says that's when I flung the banner and I stopped practicing the other methods. He has a setback in 1876. He has typhoid fever. He loses a year of his life, and he comes out from that very gaunt looking and lost a lot of weight. He had a neuropathy, and I walked with Kaner staff after that. They began to call him the old doctor because he turned kind of gray and looked kind of gaunt. And if you liked him, he called him the old doctor. If you didn't like him, he called him the old Indian doctor because he spoke Shawnee. He thought in Shawnee. He could read it. He could write it. His father summoned him from Missouri to come there because he could help him with the Shawnee Indian. And we know this because his daughter Blanche tells us about it. Also, his mother had Shawnee. So as he and his daughter Blanche end up having a very close relationship because he taught her this language. And she says they thought in Shawnee. Oftentimes, when he was thinking about a treatment plan, he would exclaim something in Shawnee first because he was thinking in Shawnee. He has growing success with his treatment plans, and they're working pretty well. And he's on his way back from Baldwin, where he'd been summoned to treat a family friend, and he gets a telegram from Colonel Sandy Lowe. And his wife has fallen sick there in Wadesburg, Missouri. It's there by Harrisonville. I think it's Wadesburg. It's the man's name. And so he goes and helps Sandy Lowe with his wife. And we know that Sandy Lowe's wife had double pneumonia because AT makes a note of it in one of his textbooks. Double pneumonia, often fatal. But he's able to save her life. And Sandy Lowe has been impressed with him. He's worked with him since 1861. He knows him really well. He's very impressed that he saved his wife. And he says, why don't you practice out of my home for a while? So he practices from the Lowe home, which is not that uncommon back then, for about 6 months. He practiced from other doctors' homes too. A Dr. Gunn up in Independence, Missouri, had a bad case of flux in children. And he knew AT had this treatment plan for flux. And so he summoned him, and he practiced with a Dr. Gunn there as well. So some of his concepts were catching on, and other doctors were talking about it. And they said, hey, why don't you teach this to us? We want to learn these methods that you have. And so he's thinking about starting a school. And he does. He tries to start a school, and he calls it the School of Bones at first, and didn't do very well. And so they keep coming to him. They say, we want you to start this school. And so he says, we have to start this school. It's got to be osteopathic. It's got to be distinctive. It has to have a complete difference from allopathic medicine. And there's a judge in Adair County. And he keeps coming to AT and says, no, you got to try doing this school again. He said, if you don't do this, this will die with you. You have to teach this to other people. And so this judge challenges him, and that gets him going again. And he has Charles, his son, go down and work with the judge. It takes a couple of years to write this charter. And they said it would have been a lot easier if it would have been an allopathic school because there were already charters for those. There were no charters for osteopathic schools, so it made it a lot harder to do this charter. And they did an excellent charter, and it's very similar to the ones we use today. And it says, you can see there, improve our present system of surgery, obstetrics, and treatment of diseases. So the American School of Osteopathic Medicine, the American School of Osteopathy is founded. Time to test our knowledge. What famous doctor or character is inspired by osteopathy? Is it Marcus Welby, Trapper John, Watson, Naismith? Let's see who it is. It's William Smith, and he becomes known famously as Watson from Sherlock Holmes. He's a Scottishman, and when he was in school at Edinburgh, one of his mentors ends up being the character for Sherlock Holmes. He's working with that mentor, and when Arthur Doyle pens Sherlock Holmes, he also pens the sidekick, which is William Smith, who is Watson. And so Smith is in Missouri. Why is he in Missouri from Scotland? He has come there because there's a manufacturing and a lot of innovation going on at that time, what they thought was very innovative, including like X-ray. And he's working for an instrument company out of St. Louis. And he's trying to sell these instruments to the doctors in Kirksville. And he goes there and he calls on the doctors. They say, well, we don't have the patients. We're not going to buy your instruments. We don't have the patients. He goes, what do you mean you don't have the patients? He said, they're all seeing that Indian doctor. He goes, what do you mean? He says, well, he's doing this musculoskeletal thing. AT still, he's that Indian. He's going, well, I'm going to go over there and debunk that guy. He doesn't know what he's doing, right? He goes over there, and AT is used to being challenged, and he talks to him, and he realizes this guy's onto something, and he converts William Smith. William Smith converts himself, and convinces himself that in fact what AT is doing is really very helpful, and he wants to learn it. So he leaves his job with this instrument company and helps found the school, helps get it off its feet, and he becomes the anatomy instructor of the very first class in exchange for learning the manipulative skills. And there they are in the amphitheater a time much later. It looks like AT's holding a cigarette, but he's holding his glasses. He never smoked or drank, really. He was very healthy. He believed he should exercise, and he ate very little. He's a very slender man. Women and osteopathy. As I said, AT's mother was very important to him. Women were always very important to him. And he said the Emancipation Proclamation didn't go far enough. It didn't cover sex or gender. And so he was an early proponent of having women in osteopathy from the very beginning. And so when he opens the first school is undersized. He's got this little house that he rents. And this theme of undersized goes on quite a while because they didn't realize how fast this thing was going to grow. I mean, he goes from 21 students to 700 students in less than a decade. It grows very fast. But here's the first class, and that's the skeleton of discovery. That's Columbus. They call the skeleton Columbus, and they're very patriotic. They have a flag there, and you can see that's the first class, 21 men. Some of them were already MDs because they were the ones that wanted to learn this, and some of them are his family members. Some are friends. Most know him. So you can see here, these are the 5 women that are in the class. And so AT is standing next to the skeleton, and he's got a staff, and he's got his elbow bent there. You can see he's standing next to the skeleton. On the other side, with his arms crossed, is William Smith. Okay, down to the elbow of AT still, down seated in a second. That woman is Nettie Bowles. Nettie Bowles becomes very important to osteopathy. She's from Olathe, Kansas. She's already has 2 degrees from Kansas University. Very smart gal. She knows AT Still. Her dad fought with AT Still in the Civil War. In fact, he's credited with saving her dad's life. He was shot in the chest. So she knows AT. Her mother becomes a somewhat invalid. She falls and hurts herself, and she can't walk very well, and she's not getting anywhere with her mother and the treatment that she's receiving in Olathe, Kansas. So she takes her mother to Kirksville to be treated by AT Still. And she's so impressed with what he does with her mother, she says, you got to teach me this. He said, well, you're in luck. We're starting a school. And she becomes one of the brightest ones in the class. In fact, they turn the anatomy instruction over to her when William Smith leaves after getting his degree. William Smith gets the first degree. It takes some of them a year, some of them 2 years, some of them more than that. That's Blanche up over the skeleton, circled in the top row. That's his daughter, Blanche. It takes her a little longer. She never really practiced osteopathy, but she was in the first class, and she eventually did graduate. She becomes kind of the hostess of all these people that are coming to Kirksville to be treated or to see this. Her and her mother host these people often at the home, and they become kind of like the ambassadors for osteopathy, you would say. His brother's in the first class, the one Ed that he treated that was addicted to morphine. He's the one seated with the gray beard down below William Smith, who has his arms crossed. The brothers reconcile. AT was forgiving. His mother had taught him forgiveness, and he forgave his brothers, and they reconciled. Edward's in the first class. That's James standing between them, and James is in the second class. And James is so impressed as well, he brings his son. His son is in the second class as well. And he has a grandson that ends up graduating from there as well. We're sustained by osteopathic advocacy. We have been from the very beginning, and we can't have an early talk about osteopathy without talking about Little John. Little John becomes very important to osteopathic medicine. He's also educated. He's a Scotsman, another Scotsman in Glasgow, very well-educated man with advanced degrees in divinity and law and language. He ends up as president of college in Amity College in Iowa Springs, Iowa. He comes to Kirksville for treatment. He's so impressed with the treatment that he receives that he leaves his president's job of a college to help found the school and support the growth that he's seeing there. And he becomes a professor and eventually the dean. He writes textbooks, he writes the first journal, and he takes osteopathy eventually international because he helps open the British school as well. And he's the first one to start using this word osteopathic medicine. He says, you have a system of care here. And AT says, yeah, I've always been saying we need this new system of care. And he says, you should call it that. You should call it osteopathic medicine. So this is very early, 1901. Since then, we use some of those same words in our own definition. So you can see here 1892, the definition, and 1991. We've just added, the emphasis that AT talked about anyway on the interrelationship of structure and function and the appreciation of the ability of the body to heal itself. But it was very important that he did this system of care, especially when it came to licensure. Otherwise, they would have only been licensed to do manipulation in America, which happened in Britain. Here are the tenets of osteopathic medicine, the AOA tenets. And they also have those same words, just in a little different format, that were on that original charter of the school and the definition of osteopathic medicine so many years later. And this is what we teach today at the school here and in all the colleges of osteopathic medicine. We teach this regional anatomy approach. When we talk about manipulation, we talk about what it will do to the system of the body or the system that you're trying to affect, whether it be biomechanical, structural, respiratory, circulatory, neurologic, metabolic, nutritional, behavioral, biopsychosocial, the 5 model concept. AT lived long enough to be revered. He, 6 months before he died, they erected this statue and had a big ribbon cutting. And this is there today in Kirksville. So he lived long enough to be revered. He was forgiving and revered at the end. You could say he was vindicated, but he was not a vengeful person, so I probably wouldn't use that word. This is AT waving goodbye to the troop that was leaving Kirksville for World War I in 1914 from his forge. He gave the goodbye speech and he said, some would come home. And I thought on Veteran Day, we would end with that and say a goodbye to our veterans as well. Do you have any questions? Yes. I do have an opinion on it. I didn't have enough time to do it, but I will go back and show you this picture here. And if you see the man to the far left top with the bushy mustache and the flat head, that's Struthers. And the man just below him with the gray beard, that's Davis. Those two guys end up in Davenport, Iowa. And they helped Palmer start the chiropractic school. And so there indeed are roots from osteopathic principles that are chiropractic. No, Struthers brought Palmer back with him. They went on break. They gave him an agricultural break so they could go work on the farms. And Struthers ends up going to Davenport. And he brings Palmer back with him. And Palmer is a patient at Kirksville. And all the students had been working on him. And he even has dinner at AT's house and talks about he had 18 treatments. And we know this because it's written in a couple of books, all written by osteopaths though. And so it's like, well, is that bias or something? So it's hard to find an unbiased person that could say, and Struthers, it becomes kind of a mercurial person. He in fact had changed his name at one point. He was trying to stay away from an ex-wife, we believe. And so he wasn't somebody that just came out and said, yeah, I gave this to Palmer. But we do find that in Oklahoma, a Palmer school opens, a Gregory Palmer school. And Palmer ends up in Oklahoma Territory after his chiropractic adventures in Davenport don't go so well. And he's doing this chiropractic in Oklahoma. And Gregory writes in textbooks that Palmer told him he got it from an osteopath named Struthers. So we have a third party that never knew AT still, was not an osteopath. Gregory was an MD who confirms that it did come from osteopathy. There are some blogs out there that reference this Gregory Palmer book that was written in the early 1900s. They had guest books at the house of all the visitors, and the guest books were really clever because they had a pig on them. They had 3 little pigs, and so they'd have this story time. And AT would tell this story about one of his first manipulations. It was this woman that he had gotten called quickly to the home. They would send the eldest son out to get the doctor. And this boy rides up on a pony and says, come quick, it's my mother. And there's kind of a storm brewing. And so he grabs his OB bag and he gets on his horse and he's chasing after this boy. And they go for a long ways and the storm gets worse and he keeps going, chasing this boy. And they get there and she's not pregnant. He's like, oh my gosh, I have the wrong bag. And so she can't breathe. She's having a respiratory problem. And she's sweaty and diaphoretic, and he thinks she has a fever. And so he says, well, I'll just use my musculoskeletal methods on her. So he's doing probably some rib raising, and she gets better. He's exhausted from this ride and this treatment. He falls asleep in the cabin. He gets up the next morning, and the family's gone. So he tells this story at dinner at the house, and so he said, the family's gone. And so he says, well, where did they go? So he goes out on the farm, and they're working on the farm. And he said, well, last night you couldn't breathe, and today you're out working on the farm. What happened? And she said, oh, we were slaughtering hogs. And, when you slaughter hogs, you hang the meat, and the meat's pretty heavy and swings. And she got struck by the snout of a hog, and she had a perfect bruise on her rib, a snout of a hog that she showed him the next morning. And so they would always tell this story. And so they had people sign into the guest book with the snout of a hog kind of thing. And so they kept these guest books, but they couldn't find the guest book that had Palmer in it. But they do indeed have these guest books. Yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. Uh-huh. And there's a lot of great stories out there. Yeah, Blanche marries a Laughlin, doesn't she? And one of my classmates, urologist in St. Louis, I think he just retired. I think he was a great grandson. Very interesting that whole web of legacy. Yes, yeah. In an hour, you could only do the early part, and there's this great history of osteopathy, though. Yeah, there's some great stories there too. Yes. Thank you very much. You're welcome.